Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Taylor Aasand, a registered dietitian and certified eating disorder specialist. Taylor runs a private practice and consulting agency in the Phoenix-Scottsdale area. She practices from a patient-centered lens and believes eating disorder recovery is possible for all patients. Taylor is passionate about policy and legislation and continues to advocate for eating disorder treatment reform at local, state, and national levels. When not at work, she enjoys spending time with her two sons, Jet and Finn. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's dive in. Taylor Aasand, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm really excited to have you on the show because you specialize in eating disorders. Mm-hmm. And most of my peers and I are focused on public health nutrition and research. So we tend to neglect eating disorders. We just kind of put it aside, even though it's obviously critically important. So I'm curious to know, how did you get interested in this? How did you develop such a passion for working with patients who are struggling with eating disorders?
Yeah. This is one of my favorite questions. And interestingly enough, I was talking to a colleague several years ago, and we had this, come to terms moment where we were like, eating disorders are absolutely a public health issue. And also my master's is in public health. So I thought I was going to work for the government. And that was a challenge for me because I wanted to see quick change, kind of like in front of my face. And an opportunity came up to work in eating disorders shortly after I graduated with my master's degree. And I've fallen in love with the patients I get to work with and the work that I get to do.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that we get to dive into this stuff. So before we get started, though, do you have any high-level stats? We're talking about children right now. So children and adolescents, how many, in the US, what % experience eating disorders? And can you tell us a little bit about maybe the most common disorders and among which demographics?
Yeah. Fortunately, a lot of people are really interested in how common eating disorders are in our population. Not surprisingly, though, the funding is not always there. But the data that we do have is that eating disorders are incredibly common. They do not have a look. So you cannot look at someone and say, you struggle with this or you struggle with this. And so with that said, the data is a little messy, but we know maybe 1 in 8 could struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lifetime.
Wow.
Children and adolescents absolutely struggle, especially with body image concerns and pressures that we have on our youth. Data and images that are accessible all the time is horrible.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a lot for those underdeveloped brains to manage. Right. So we're seeing increasing rates, unfortunately. But yeah, the data is high.
Okay. Well, that's hard to hear, and it's not surprising. I looked at a stat, and I'm not very familiar with this, so you'll have to educate me. But there's, this term eating disorders is used, and I've seen kind of global stats that are relatively low. I don't remember, maybe 5 or 6% among children and adolescents. But I've also seen a stat of disordered eating that seemed maybe a little bit of a looser criteria or less strict, where it's any form of sort of disordered eating that was around 22%, which is pretty high. Can you tell us a little bit of the nuance around that? What does it mean to have an eating disorder? Are there certain types of systems that classify that?
So eating disorders are medical diagnoses. And so we reference the DSM-5 for that. So we would have a clinician, so this could be a psychologist or a medical doctor, have an assessment with a patient and then say, based on this conversation or, the evaluation that was conducted, you meet the criteria for this. So someone could be struggling with an eating disorder and not actually get a diagnosis, because that would mean they would have to consider there maybe be an issue or a problem or a concern with their relationship with food or their body. And that's hard because I think, to your point, disordered eating is kind of engaging in behaviors that we could argue are not healthy. when it comes to food.
Okay.
And our society pushes a lot of it. This could be like dieting. This could be like skipping meals, avoiding certain food groups. So
maybe most of us.
up to 90% of the U.S. population dabbles in disordered eating.
Yeah. But maybe it's undiagnosed in terms of a formal eating disorder because the person has to come into the, whether that's a psychiatrist or other practitioner, right? And actually say, look, I have this issue. I need help for it, right?
100%.
Okay. Well, let's get into a few of the specifics. So there is this disorder called avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Did I say that right?
Yep.
ARFID. Okay.
Yeah.
So most people probably haven't heard of this, but can you tell us what it is and how common is it among children?
Yeah. Oh, this is a heartbreaking disorder for several reasons. So it's newer. We just put a name to it in 2013, actually.
Okay.
And people have been struggling with symptoms of ARFID or ARFID specifically for decades. And I've seen patients come to my office and they've been like, oh, I've been dealing with this since I was a child. And how I would summarize it to the general population, it's like selective or picky eating, but to the extreme. So where like growth is being compromised, social situations, relationships are being compromised. And it's scary. A lot of times the advice, if someone has ARFID or if a parent brings a child into an office, like a pediatrician might generally say like, oh, they'll grow out of it.
Yeah.
And parents are like, no, you don't get it. Like my kid's not going to come to the table and eat. They're really more comfortable avoiding or not engaging with food. And it can lead to really scary situations where we use like feeding tubes to provide nutritional support, hospitalization. I'm seeing actually a lot of that in my practice right now. So like Phoenix Children's here has been sending a lot of these really extreme ARFID patients to my office after acute stabilization.
Wow. So it's sounds very severe. And you're saying picky eating is not the same thing. And my daughter, I have a 5 and 8-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
My 8-year-old right now, her favorite food, at least in my house, probably because I don't have the best tasting food, is this like lentil pasta with cheese. And she uses this English coastal cheddar from Costco. She just she could eat it for every meal. And now I'm worried. I'm like, okay, I need to branch out here because this is picky eating. She obviously doesn't have ARFID at this point, but you're saying ARFID is like, you don't actually get enough food to nourish yourself. You may end up in the hospital. Is that
Correct.
right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So that sounds like easier to detect. So are there subtler warning signs maybe before that develops that parents, teachers, or pediatricians should look out for?
So I think right now, people say up to 15% of the population could potentially have ARFID or meet the diagnostic criteria for it.
That's high. That's higher than I would have expected.
High. So there can be milder forms. So I've worked with adults who've been like, oh yeah, like certain textures or certain foods, certain smells. I just like can't really engage with this food. And there might be some anxieties around like, well, crap, I have this work dinner and there's so much anxiety because this patient might not feel like they can feed themselves in that situation.
Yeah.
So that could be maybe like a milder representation. In these extreme cases, kids are literally like, I cannot eat it. It is like a nervous system shutdown. It is, and there's really no resolution, right? We might say like, well, just force your kid to eat. We're like, well, that's not really a solution here because I can't force my kid to eat every meal forever. And that's arguably traumatic.
Yeah.
So then that's where medical intervention is needed. And what's really unfortunate is because this is such a new disease, we don't really know a lot about it, which means we don't know a heck of a lot about how to treat it.
Tricky. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're learning about it, I'm sure.
Right.
What are some of the maybe immediate and long-term consequences? So you said potentially being malnourished, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are some other health consequences that happen?
Like short term, if we have someone who might be avoiding food, right? So avoidant restrictive food intake disorder is like, I'm avoiding food. Maybe it's causing me anxiety. This is not body image driven. So that's really the distinction between ARFID and like anorexia nervosa, let's say.
Okay.
And for whatever reason, anxiety, maybe there's a fear of throwing up or choking. So sometimes incidents like that can kind of like trigger this disease, or that's kind of what we're coming to see a lot in practice. And they're like, not worth it. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
So Short-term consequences are kids can stunt their growth or development.
Mm.
They're struggling in school because they just can't feed themselves well enough to like keep up, or they're prone to injuries like in school sports. So I'm actually seeing some of that in my practice too. Like, oh, it could be like an athlete, let's say, have an
Yeah.
incident happen, or picky eating again kind of crosses that line into like, oh, we're concerned now medically. We're seeing some
It's having an
signs.
impact on their life. It's not just like, they don't, they don't always like what I put out for dinner. It's like, this is really having some negative consequences for them.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, you said there's not a lot that we can do for treatment, but you are an RD and you do work with children in this area. So what do you try to do? How do you sort of approach this when you have a patient that comes to you with this condition?
Yeah. So what we are learning, thankfully, because we're seeing how prevalent this is and we want to do something about it. So individualized nutrition approaches are the gold standard when it comes to
Okay.
ARFID. So if I were to see someone in my practice, I would assess their relationships with foods. Usually patients do have safe foods of some sort, like foods they are willing to eat most of the time. And then we really kind of capitalize on those to kind of address the malnutrition issue. Simultaneously, we're working on exposure.
Okay.
Trying to incorporate foods that aren't extremely threatening, but maybe someone wants to have a better relationship.
So encouraging consumption of those foods that they already tolerate, that are part of their diet, but eat more because you need to get enough calories in general, probably.
Exactly. And then there's medical foods that help us too.
Exactly. And then you can introduce these foods that are maybe not ideal for these children, but they're willing to try them. Can you get to this place of full recovery where it's just they're thriving, they eat everything and it's all gone?
Such a great question. I love to tell patients and their families, I was like, we need to have appropriate expectations here.
Okay.
So like, is it a helpful expectation to be like, well, this kid needs to eat steak to be in recovery? Probably not. But do they need to be able to eat enough protein to be healthy? Yeah. So we might find somewhere, some middle ground.
Okay. Do you see any, last question on this area for me, I'm just curious, do you see any specific foods or food groups that are often targeted? Like, I can't eat these types of foods. Or on the flip side, foods that are just really widely accepted even by children with this condition?
Yeah. Oh, great question. Foods that are predictable tend to be the safer food items. So this is like carbs or prepared foods, prepackaged foods. Foods that are harder or a little more unpredictable, like animal proteins, they can be cooked differently and have different textures, and then fruits and vegetables, because depending on, the ripeness or the season, they're different.
Yeah. I noticed that, like, if my daughters try a bad avocado or a bad tomato, then they don't want to try it again. Like, right? Like I introduced, I'm like, okay, here, have it. And they're like, no, I don't want it. I'm like, no, it's a good one. It's in season. Right. And that's a challenge. Okay.
Yes, exactly that.
Okay. So let's talk about some conditions we've maybe heard a bit more about, but most of us probably don't really understand the ins and outs. So anorexia nervosa is one that's pretty common. It's well known, but maybe misunderstood. How do you define it in clinical terms?
Great question. Anorexia nervosa tends to be like the most publicized eating disorder. It's kind of how I would say it's. We kind of have seen it maybe in the media in some way. We associate it with eating disorders, so people might think of anorexia nervosa and think of like a thin white woman or in her like early 20s, like
right.
But it's a poor representation of the eating disorder patient population in general. We say only about 6% of people with eating disorders would have that characteristic or trait.
Okay. So it's very diverse, I'm hearing.
Exactly. So this goes back to like, we can't look at someone and tell if they have an eating disorder or anorexia nervosa.
Okay.
But it's a restrictive eating disorder. And different than ARFID, there is that body image component.
Right.
So we are trying to look a certain way. There is a fear of weight gain, and this can make it really complicated to treat.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
And I'm sure our society doesn't do us any favors. It's it's hard to be a child out there, especially probably girls and adolescents growing up. So
Yeah.
can you tell us within children and adolescents? So these, this age group ranges from young children to up to maybe 19 years for an adolescent, or youth that get up to maybe 24 years of age. Who is most at risk? And do you see any patterns? Like, are things happening where younger children are starting to have these disorders, or is it sort of consistent across over time?
It's a great question. And from my perspective, the answer is heartbreaking. So kids younger and younger are starting to engage with those disordered eating behaviors. Like we have some data, limited, like kids as young as 6 are trying to diet.
Wow.
You could imagine like a first grade classroom, and who you might see in there that like they're already aware of their bodies and then trying to control them.
Oh my
From like a
gosh.
public health perspective, no kid should be on a weight loss plan.
Yeah.
So it's tricky. What put kids at risk is I've seen like sometimes conversations at like pediatricians' offices. Unfortunately, like the pediatrician might say, "Hey, you're this weight or that weight," or be worried about someone's weight, and that can kind of trigger some of those thoughts and behaviors in kids. Dieting in the home and then bullying tend to be big risk factors.
Wow. So what their pediatrician says to them, what their peers say, especially I guess bullies.
Mhm.
Um, what about the social media, regular media? How is that influencing? Obviously, like there's this culture on social media, on movies, on TV shows, even on video games of like being thin and looking a certain way to sort of have your value. So what is going on there, and how do we combat that? Like, what do you do when you have teenagers maybe who are looking at social media content and feeling like they need to look a certain way to be accepted or valued by society?
The comparison is so hard. I usually compassionately tell my teenage patients, I was like, I could not do what you do. I could not walk around in your shoes at 15 or 17. I can't imagine what this is like. Um, and we usually do like a social media audit. So we might like go through it and in session and say, okay, who makes you feel good about yourself? Let's keep those people. Who makes you not feel good about yourself? Let's maybe mute them or delete them. And then here might be some recommendations of people to follow on social media. So there's like some really beautiful corners of social
Okay.
media that we just might want to have more exposure to.
There are positives and negatives of it, but you have to be really careful.
You have to be so careful.
And you know what? I think some countries are actually banning social media. I heard Australia recently banned social media for, I think it was children less than 16,
Oh,
something like that. How do you feel about that?
I could see why that would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Incredibly
Because
helpful.
how do you use it safely? Okay, so you have a patient who comes to you. You can give them this valuable insight to go through their, social media pages. It's probably hard for them to do that, right? But what about for the rest of us, right? For the rest of the children out there who don't have a one-on-one person telling them that, how do you go about social media in general?
Maybe I can answer it this way. I would never recommend someone who does not have social media to get social media. I think so many people have this fear of not being connected.
Yeah.
Not
Loneliness.
Yes, not knowing what's going on. It, it's challenging. So I might even say that to the population or the public. Like I wouldn't recommend starting it if you've never before. And if you have it, maybe kind of do a broader audit of like, what is it giving you? What is it taking from you? Do we need to have loving boundaries
Yeah.
around our social media use? Do you need to take a break? See how you feel, experiment.
Okay. So you can try things out. And I like that you're recognizing that there is this you could call this an epidemic of loneliness. I mean, people, not just adults, but children are feeling very isolated, I think. And so in-person interaction is great, but to whatever extent you don't have a fulfilling community, maybe social media for some people is a way to get that. So there could be that positive, but as you're saying, so many pitfalls to worry about. I like how you're talking about audit. Like maybe being intentional is a key step, just not just mindlessly going about it. If you're a parent and you're still having influence over your children, you can play a role in that. Okay, well, what does it look like? Can we do this in a safe way that has more benefits than harm?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So if we're looking into treatment, so somebody with anorexia, sure, there's a lot of different forms of this, but like when you have a patient come in, how do you approach it? And then what is your role versus their doctor versus their family? How does everyone play a part in this process?
And it's a great question. So if someone were to come into my office for the first time, usually they are referred by somebody. And it tends to be either a doctor, a therapist, or a psychiatrist.
Okay.
And with eating disorders, we have a multidisciplinary team in place. So if someone does come to me through their doctor, I might then say, okay, go see this person as a therapist. So we have several people and supports in place. I am one to try to keep a patient out of hospitalization.
Okay.
If possible. I want to keep patients at home. I want to keep them in their life. I feel like that is very valuable. Sometimes we don't have that privilege or luxury, and we might even need to, if we're, not making progress, or maybe someone's declining in health, we might need to send them to a hospital like Phoenix Children's or a residential treatment program.
Okay. So that's sort of, you're saying that's sort of your last resort, because ideally, if you can be surrounded by maybe a family support system, community, and really get the treatment you need, that's a peaceful way to do that.
Yeah.
It's not always the case, it sounds like. So in some circumstances, you need to really refer out. Well, what is the journey like? I imagine this is not like you come in for 3 sessions and you're done.
Yeah.
It's probably a long journey, a long road. Can you tell us what success looks like? Like, do people graduate? Do you get to a point where you're like, okay, so you're at a healthy weight and you have addressed maybe a lot of the psychological, emotional reasons for this disorder. Are there, okay, now you can just relax, or is this like a lifelong, you got to be careful?
So, I mean, what I've seen and what I've heard from my patients, some of them do feel like, oop, that was a thing of my past. I'm good. Like, we did it. I think a lot of that has to do with early intervention, truthfully. Like, the younger a patient comes in, when they come to see me, the quicker we are as a team or a family to intervene, the better the outcome. And we have data to support that. Like, earlier intervention has a better prognosis.
Okay.
If someone's been struggling for a long time, which just tends to be the case for patients with eating disorders, because we would have to assume that people in your life knew what was going on, that it wasn't just disordered eating, that you had doctors or therapists or treatment team members in place early.
Mm-hmm.
Just usually not what we see. So the treatment tends to be longer. Some studies say that it could take up to 7 years to recover from an eating disorder, and recovery, there's a lot of different definitions out there. Some patients, especially in those circumstances, are like, this might always be a thing that I have to kind of keep my eye on, but I know kind of like what remission feels like.
Okay.
So we might use different language.
Okay. So you said something about when you're seeing patients, the earlier intervention is better. And I know it's hard to get into help, whether that's for therapy, even going to the doctor. But when we're talking about children, parents play a role here too. So maybe being really attuned to what's going on with your kids, observing them, talking with them, and then encouraging or starting having a consult or treatment if you suspect something. Is that right? Like, how would you approach your child if you suspect there's some potential eating disorder going on, like anorexia?
Yeah. As you're asking me that question, what came to mind, and it was this really attuned mom, and she struggled with an eating disorder herself.
Okay.
And she felt very comfortable being like, something seems off. I'm going to take you in. And I did. I only worked with that daughter short term. Mom was incredibly proactive. I think what stops a lot of parents, and this is from my conversations with them, is you hope that you're wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that human nature in us is kind of like, okay, like my kid's still eating, right? They're like, well, my kid's eating. It's not that bad. You kind of have that
minimizing it.
Are that sick enough?
You don't want to admit it because if it feels bad when you love them, you could be partly responsible, right? There's some sort of ownership of that. Okay. So what about now prevention? Thinking about when we have kids and we love them and we are very influential to them, right? The peers are important too. And that's something we can't always control. But at least in our homes, what types of things can we be doing? Maybe not talking about, oh, I need to lose that 5 pounds, or oh, I'm feeling tubby, or things like that, right?
Yes.
Is that what else can we do to help make sure that our kids don't fall into this disordered eating, or specifically of anorexia?
Great question. And you're right on the money. So like, we're not going to talk about our kids' bodies, and we're not going to talk about our bodies, arguably in positive or negative ways.
Okay.
So sometimes that can be a challenge too. Like if we see someone, or if our bodies change and we're like, oh, I look so much, like it feels positive. It might not be interpreted in a positive way, right? Like it's almost like, what is my kid perceiving this conversation meaning?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be just as damaging, or saying, oh, I don't like my body. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
It makes sense. You're saying, if you kind of, you're looking at yourself and you're like, I look so good. You're kind of positively reinforcing that you need to look this way to feel good about yourself, right? And then, of course, I think the more obvious one is you don't say, hey, you look really bad. You need to eat something, right? It's more, so I'll have maybe a little more nuanced question. What about this sort of issue with the actual health of the child in terms of their physiology, right? So a kid may be overweight or obese. They may have, maybe the pediatrician sees that there's prediabetes, which is increasing. So we do have this real chronic disease crisis. How do we walk the line to make sure we don't fall into either category of like ignoring some sort of chronic disease and not encouraging some sort of eating disorder?
Yeah. Oh, this one's so tough. And I remember, this was years ago, having conversations with some folks at the Arizona Department of Health. And I was consulting with them because we wanted to shift the narrative from, we call it weight-centric care, to weight-neutral care. So it's almost like, okay, whatever the number on the scale is for this kiddo, what if we kind of like keep this over here? Mm-hmm. And then we say, but I see this data, right? Like your A1C is high. We're worried about your health. Let's talk about the behaviors.
Okay.
And so the argument is weight isn't a behavior, but maybe like what you're eating, your relationship with food, sleep, overall self-care. Also, this kid doesn't control much of their food environment.
That's the tough part.
So, what conversations are we having with parents, loved ones, supports, maybe at school, to create the environment for these kids to be healthy? What I hate seeing is when something like that happens to a kid, the doctor, or the message received, right, from the kid's perspective is, oh, my weight's the problem in this situation. And then that's where the disordered eating starts. That's where we're at risk for an eating disorder. So
it becomes more about the appearance as opposed to the biological health. And that's so tricky when you say the food environment, because, in the work that I do, we're very aware that the food environment is pretty terrible in a lot of ways, right? Like there's some positives and negatives about it, but it's challenging, in schools and in hospitals, and with all the marketing to children with food. And then if you have your home is full of this stuff, some people, it's not perfectly even, right? Some people, their genetics make them more likely to gain weight and have chronic disease issues, and other people, they don't. So
Mhm.
even if you have multiple kids in the house, one kid may be able to eat whatever they want in an environment of food where it's junk food mostly and be just fine,
Mhm.
and another kid may not. So I just imagine that has to be so tricky. How do you navigate that? So I mean, you can't, of course, we can't solve all these issues, but I think these are important things to hear,
Yeah.
because in my field, as I said at the start, we're so concerned about the chronic disease thing, and we know, like, obesity is associated with all sorts of health things. So we look at it more on this sort of public health perspective. But what I'm hearing you say is, like, we can't just ignore this huge issue of eating disorders, especially in the US, right? Like,
Mhm.
where these are very common. And I think probably, as patterns and trends happen, other countries follow suit, right?
Yes.
Media, social media, it's all spreading all over. So even if it's higher in the US now and in high income countries, probably a lot of countries, it's going to be increasing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to another disorder that's maybe not as commonly understood as anorexia, but relatively common. So bulimia nervosa. Sometimes harder to detect, maybe because you don't see dramatic weight loss, which can happen sometimes with anorexia. What are the common signs and symptoms that parents or friends might notice to be aware of?
Bulimia and nervosa is tough. It's tough to treat. And a lot of that has to do with the compensatory behavior, how that can be addictive, of course, compulsive, um, and incredibly hard to abstain from. And so oftentimes, like some of the first signs or symptoms could be if like someone is engaging in purging via self-induced vomiting as like dental
Mhm.
issues,
Okay.
or signs on their fingers. Um, Oftentimes though, like what I've seen is behaviorally, you might start to notice like someone going to the bathroom a lot after meals or spending more time in the gym because exercise is also a form of purging.
Uh,
So it doesn't, or laxative use. So it doesn't always have to be one mechanism for the purging behavior, if that
okay.
makes sense. So I would really try to just be aware of that it doesn't have to mean vomiting and that behaviorally you're going to notice some signs.
Yeah. What you're doing after dinner? Are you going to the gym excessively? And maybe the reason for going to the gym, right?
Mhm.
I wasn't aware. I think that's important to know. It's not just about vomiting. It's really about other mechanisms like working out to
Yeah.
try to lose that weight of that whatever you just ate, right?
Mhm.
So, in terms of physical health, short term, long term, what are the consequences here? Even if you don't necessarily lose weight, what is happening there in the body?
When it comes to bulimia,
When bulimia
yeah,
specifically.
yeah. So what lab values like electrolyte imbalances, the impact like the binging and restriction has on someone's overall cardiovascular system is incredibly scary. We do
Mm,
sometimes see extreme weight loss in these in patients with bulimia, and behaviors tend to just get worse and more extreme over time.
wow.
It's incredibly secretive. Most of the behaviors are shameful, but
Yeah.
there are times too, like if it is the gym or exercise, where like loved ones will actually start or will praise the person for these behaviors in the beginning, which can be confusing. If that
Oh,
kind of makes sense. Like, oh, I love this. You're like going to the gym more often. I'm so proud of you. And then we kind of have this like, uh-oh moment where we're realizing that this is part of a disease. This isn't actually a healthy habit.
wow. So it's not just getting regular exercise. It's if I eat anything, I need to immediately go to the gym and work off all of those calories right
Mhm.
away. I'm curious to know, like, I personally, when I have certain foods, I have trouble stopping. Like, if I have a plate of cookies,
Yeah.
as soon as I have one cookie, like, I'm done. I'm finishing that cookie, and I like have to have another. Like, I have this craving. So how do you distinguish between a disorder
Yeah.
of binging versus foods? Are a lot of the foods in our modern food environment are these ultra processed foods are very addicting. They're sort of formulated to be making you want to keep eating even after you've met all of your calorie needs, right? So what's the distinction there?
The eating disorder specialist in me would say, how often are we around some of these foods that we feel this pull towards? Because foods that tend to be activating in that way are usually like restricted foods or not always available foods.
Right.
So it might be like, oh, should we work on our relationship with these delicious cookies? And if we practice habituation around them, would we still feel that way?
Got it. So can you clarify? So having them around more frequently. So it's less of a, oh my gosh, this is so good, I can't stop. It's more like, okay, maybe after dinner I'll have this one cookie because it's more consistent. Okay.
We call it like the last hurrah mentality, if that makes sense. There might be this voice in our head being like, oh, I'm being so naughty, or like, I'm going to just get rid of this food so I don't have to deal with this feeling tomorrow.
Yeah, get it out of the house, finish the box.
Yeah, or who knows when these are going to be around again. So like we can see this in a kind of, I would say, healthy way, like around the holidays, right? Like if there's like special holiday treats or traditions that we have, yeah, we might feel a certain way around pumpkin pie or whatever, because we know we only get that once a year.
Right.
But sometimes we're even noticing those patterns or behaviors in foods because we have these internal rules around them, like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this right now. And so that could be a great opportunity to practice habituation. Most people, when we have this conversation or experiment in this way, they're kind of like, oh, that would make sense for me. If it ever feels like that doesn't make sense and it's something else, then it's like, oh, okay, maybe we need to investigate further and see what's really going on.
So can you maybe give me some specifics? Like, let's say dessert after dinner. Do you recommend for this, if you have trouble with eating too much of a particular type of food, let's say it's desserts, do you recommend trying to have maybe a smaller quantity more frequently than a large quantity infrequently, or how would you go about it?
Yeah. Gosh, great question. So I am not a let's limit our food person.
Okay.
I really don't agree with that, because usually underneath the surface, we have a few different things going on. Are you eating enough food throughout the day? So like we can't be mad at ourselves for eating a sleeve of Oreos if like we had coffee for breakfast and a salad for lunch, and then we're like in that situation, right? So you might
need a lot of food at that point.
Yeah, like there's your breakfast, that sleeve of Oreos.
Right.
So we might actually have like an undernourishment issue, and then those types of foods just might be kind of like making up in that way. Let's say everyone's nutritional needs are being met. Like we're getting like proteins, grains, fruits, veggies, fibers. Honestly, for most people, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
So it's a great place to start. Then we might say like, okay, let's just like have some Oreos. Let's give ourselves permission to do it, or dessert, every night with dinner. We're eating it at the same time. We don't have to We don't have to wait until after dinner to have it with the meal. And then let's see how you feel in 2 weeks. Most people, that's when that habituation gets in, and they're like, oh, I know I'm having dessert every day forever and ever and ever. Kind of loses the appeal. Then it's just a food. We're trying to neutralize all foods. Like there's no good foods, bad foods, just like food.
Right. Okay. So having it be more regular, and what you're also saying is making sure you're eating in general a healthy diet, just in terms of like, you make sure you get enough calories. Don't skip breakfast unless you have a particular, I think, healthy reason to do that. Some people do, but in general, don't just like forgo a bunch of calories and then open a box of Oreos, because that's very clearly most of us are going to eat a way too many Oreos right at that time.
Right.
Okay. So what about treatment strategies for bulimia now, when we're talking about, patient comes in with this, maybe their parent has noticed, or they've been referred to by a therapist. Is this similar to anorexia, or are there some different nuances about the treatment?
Yeah. I am of the practicing belief that all eating disorders are restrictive. There is some level or form of restriction. In bulimia, nervosa, there is. So we do the diet history, or I have patients like log their food for me in some way, shape, or form. And there 100% of the time is an undernourishment issue.
Okay.
So we're going to start there and be like, this is what the appropriate amount of food looks like for you. How can we try to get you there? What's hard is a lot of these patients are very fearful of engaging in those compensatory behaviors. So like if I eat too much, then I'm going to feel the need to. So we work a lot on that, distress tolerance, maybe even just like from a harm reduction approach, like delaying those compensatory behaviors, not even trying to abstain from them in the beginning, but like we just push it off for 5 minutes. Okay, push it off for 10 minutes. That's even progress.
Okay. That makes sense. So how about for families now? Anything different about bulimia versus anorexia? If you're a parent and you're really wanting to support someone, you're trying to figure out the best ways to help them recover, whether that's with a dietitian or without.
Oh, I think, for all the families out there going through this, the more compassion you can bring is very helpful. And really kind of understanding that these aren't conscious choices patients are making. This is the disease and how it works. So the more
Mhm.
family can understand about the disease itself, the more equipped they're going to be able to support their loved one. And for bulimia nervosa, I would recommend just like hanging out, having things going on after eating times.
Right.
So, right, like that might not be as much of a priority with someone who has just a restrictive eating disorder, but it's like the distress tolerance after meals and food times is crucial
That
for
makes
this patient
sense.
population.
Yeah. So educating yourselves, having compassion, and then planning maybe after meals to have some activities so that it's easier to sort of not do the behavior that's destructive. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about intuitive eating because this is something I haven't really heard about until I looked into it recently, and it's getting more attention recently. What would you say it is in simple terms?
Yeah. Um, so intuitive eating, I think, is misunderstood, even in the eating disorder field.
Hmm.
Um, I think everyone could benefit from intuitive eating, but that's only if the people listening or who I'm talking to understand what I mean by that. So to describe it, it's like a self-care framework when it comes to food.
Hmm.
It is not just eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full. There's 10 principles, and one of them is like rejecting the diet mentality. I'm like, I can't think of one person who would not benefit from like stepping away from fad diets
Mhm.
or, identifying foods that are satisfying or feeling good or the component of like gentle nutrition. So it's like nutrition science is important. Like I want to maybe treat a chronic health condition or honor my body with food, but how do I not let it kind of go over to this category that's extreme, potentially damaging or anxiety inducing?
Okay. So is it really about having balance where, no foods are bad? There's different roles of food. So maybe there are foods that may have more nutritional value and those benefit you in certain ways, but then there's foods that have social value, foods that make you feel good. And you're saying it's not a problem to think of foods and understand that there's benefits in different ways to our overall health. At the same time, how do you sort of navigate the balance side of things? Are there sort of techniques within intuitive eating where you can sort of avoid the binging or the whatever it is that could potentially someone could fall into?
Yeah. Intuitive eating really uses a lot of Kristen Neff's research on self compassion.
Hmm.
So let's say someone binges or overeats. Coming at that with compassion, I could argue that like it is normal to overeat at times.
Mhm.
Could also be normal to like undereat at times. Like maybe you have a swamped day and you're like, oh crap, like I just poor time management.
Mhm.
What if we like approached all of that some compassion and understanding and then didn't judge the crap out of ourselves if we ate more than we normally do at dinner because we had a shitty lunch?
Right.
So I think that's what intuitive eating means to me.
Mhm.
is trying not to be so perfect with food and really knowing that we're an individual and my needs are different than your needs, and we have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think for me, I think about our transition from maybe a food environment where we, before agriculture, our ancestors kind of lived in this environment where the only foods they had access to were kind of more nourishing foods. But like you said, like whenever they had food, they would eat, like
Yes.
if you find a honey, it's
Yeah.
like you're going to eat as much of that as you can because you can't carry much. Right. And so I think and then, you don't have food for a meal or something. It's okay. Like, right. And I think what I'm sort of curious about is your perspective on this food environment. So part of our challenge is that our foods have changed so much. And I'm hearing you say like you don't like, especially for people who are maybe at risk for eating disorders, you don't want to label foods as good or bad because there's a big um, temptation to have disordered eating or eating disorders from that. At the same time, how do you navigate the reality that we have this food environment, we have marketing to kids, and there is this challenge of how do we make sure, like, it's easier to be naturally eat all the foods that are going to nourish you if you're not surrounded by all those foods. But if you're surrounded by them, how do we do that? How do we make sure we can stay in that balanced range where we don't go to eating disorders and we don't go to, chronic diseases on the other side?
It's a great question. What's great, I'm talking to the parents, or having parents in mind, like, we get to decide what food comes in our household. If we're trying to help our kids
Mhm.
foster healthy relationships with food, like, we can be a dessert household, we can be a dessert a couple nights a week, we can like and how we talk about food and having healthy conversations around that is what's gonna be the most helpful.
Right.
We can have certain snacks available. What I've seen, and I actually had a conversation with a patient this morning, is then sometimes parents will be like, "Oh my gosh, well, you're raiding the pantry over at so and so's house." And then there's like shame or conversations around that because of, okay, our kids inclined to these foods, they might not be available at our house. And so that's where that, again, that last hurrah mentality can kind of kick in, even for our kids.
Mm,
So it's kind of educating ourselves, knowing that we can control what we can control, and then making sure our kids have healthy skills to be successful in those situations.
So give me an example of this, okay? So you have
Yeah.
kids. I have kids. Most of us have kids. And let's say, I just want to hear a conversation that you would have that would sort of, what you're saying is sort of a healthy communication about food. Okay. So let's
Mhm.
say you have your house, you have a bunch of different diversity of foods and you have desserts and you have treats and all sorts of things. How would you talk to your kids about, and of course, the age probably matters, but in general, how would you sort of talk to kids about foods in a healthy way to support a
Yeah.
good, positive relationship with food?
Yeah. So I have an example of this. There was an education that happened at my kids' preschool that I wasn't like super thrilled with because they were labeling food as junk food versus not junk food. And I don't do that at my house.
Mm,
Right. And so it's like, I can't have that. It's junk food. So my 4-year-old said to me, and I said, "What's junk food?" I approached it with curiosity. I was like, "Tell me what you mean by that. I'm curious."
mhm.
Um, and I don't think he knew what it meant. And so I just took that opportunity because he didn't come back with a response. I said, "Well, all food's important. What foods should we have for dinner to make us strong today?" I think we had like just a variety of different things.
Mhm.
And so that's how I've approached it with younger kids to make sure they're understanding, because I don't want my kids to shame food. I don't want them to feel shame when they eat food. I don't want them to shame other kids.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to say is like there shouldn't be a moral value assigned to the food we eat.
Got it. Yeah, I
A
agree.
and, the conversation will likely evolve as kids get older, right? And we might be able to have some of like, well, we need to make sure we're having all the food groups tonight, or that's not on the menu tonight can be a really great one. If like a kid wants something, let's say there's like Halloween candy in a cupboard or something, and they want to have all that before dinner. You're like, oh, that's not on the menu right now. be a great way to just redirect the conversation.
Okay.
But we try to avoid the good food, bad food, junk food, healthy food conversation.
So how about, a family has 2 kids. One of the kids, um, doesn't have any sort of, chronic disease, but another kid does. Like, let's say it's prediabetes, or something where maybe it's even maybe it's type 2 diabetes or prediabetes.
Yeah.
How would you approach that conversation, in that case?
So like if someone's nutritional needs were different than their siblings.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What does a family conversation look like then?
How I would approach it, and I've seen this in my practice, is there's probably not many people who wouldn't benefit from like some of the same conversations we would have for a patient with, prediabetes or type 2, the rest of this family.
Mm.
Like, I bet all y'all need more fiber,
Yeah.
or like, what are our meals looking like? I would get curious and then probably make familial recommendations rather than targeting the child.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we know about families eat in general, it's like people have more on their plates than ever. We're trying to make the world go round. They all use a little structure and balance. Probably start there. And then if a kiddo needs medication or, other interventions, we might have a conversation around how everyone's needs are different and how can we not compare.
Mm-hmm. What about with portion control? Do you recommend, like, let's say it's a dessert or if it's a snack or something, do you go about any sort of guidance to children or adolescents on how much should you eat of a certain food, or do you have a different approach? And do you time it like you said desserts, having kind of dessert foods out at the same time as dinner? How do you approach the sort of quantity issue?
Interestingly enough, we talk a lot about servings and portion sizes when it comes to like a patient's meal plan. And usually I'm like, well, this is what a serving of fruits and vegetables is, or this is a serving of protein. And most people are floored. They're like, I had no idea. They're more likely to underportion than overportion.
Really?
So I usually get to come back to like, I'm not here to like limit the amount of dessert you're having, but I need to make sure you're getting all of the other stuff I need you to have. And that has been very successful in my practice. Most people, again, it's like the binge eating or that I guess like that compulsion related behavior, like, oh, I need more, the binge, the out of control, it comes from a place of undernourishment in some form.
Hmm.
Maybe they only get cake once in a while. Like there's usually a story behind it.
Okay.
It's not that, oh, all of our needs are met, I'm taking really great care of myself, and then there's this portioning issue.
So what about in the timing? So if you have dessert foods out for the meal, is there a risk that a child would eat so much that they fill up on the dessert food and then they don't meet their needs for other food groups?
I have not seen it in that way unless there could be like let's say ARFIDs on the table. Like I would probably not recommend that strategy to a patient with ARFID if we have like one of their preferred foods as the dessert, and then the foods we're trying to work on our relationship with the others. Because then it's like, well,
They're
see you
going to
later.
fill up and then they won't eat it.
Yeah. But if
Yeah.
we're talking about like a kid that we just want to work on their relationship with food, they surprise us a lot of the time. If we have, and parents, we might need to be the ones in the beginning modeling, like, here's what a serving of cupcakes looks like. It's one cupcake, like we're not having a tray of cupcakes on the table. We might say, here's the servings or the approximate portions of all of the foods we need. Here's the cupcake. Try to make a pleasant eating environment. We're not talking about the food. We're not shaming people. Our kids usually surprise us, and we want them to have this skill.
Yeah. Yeah. And I heard you say something in one of your previous examples where you said, and earlier you said, don't talk about their bodies, right? But you did talk about what's going to make us feel strong, right? And so I think there is this, if I understand correctly, there is this potential healthy way to talk about some sort of aspect of what the food brings to them in a way that doesn't make them think about their appearance. So maybe it's their strength or some sort of like, oh, we want to be able to focus in school, or maybe we want to be able to do really well at our basketball game tonight. Are those types of things generally the positive approach?
Absolutely. Like, what function is this food gonna
focusing on the function of it
rather than how this is gonna make you look.
Right. Okay. And then I assume in the same way, when you're talking about food, if you talk about food for yourself in the same way.
Yeah.
But also, like, it's okay to maybe not talk about food so much. Don't focus on the nutrition of the food so much,
right,
and more so create an environment in a context where there's lots of different things, lots of options. One of the things that we've changed recently, which I've noticed has been really positive, is that we put out lots of different options.
Yeah.
And I don't put anything on my kids' plates. And so I let them say, okay, so I'm going to have this, and I'm going to have this, and I'm going to have this, because that gives them the choice. And what I notice is if you have a lot of diversity, it helps make sure that they'll eat enough. Like, usually you're not going to go without. You'll end up eating. And my mistake, I think, has been when I'm busy and I don't take the time and energy to prepare a lot of stuff. I just want to have like one thing, and it's the same thing, and it's just like salt on it and there's no flavor. So I think that's probably, it takes work, but if you can create a dinner table where you have lots of options, that's one strategy.
Such a great point. And we call that family style. Family style.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm learning a lot. I'm sure people have learned a lot from this, because this is very much not the type of discussion we typically have. Yeah. And so I'm really, really thankful to you, Taylor. If you had to just kind of share one thing that maybe it's a misconception, or maybe it's something that people don't quite understand, what would your main takeaway be for somebody from this episode, just to sort of drive some sort of key message home to them?
Yeah. It's okay, I'll make it like a two-parter.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, okay. Like, eating disorders, we're still trying to understand them. But if you suspect yourself have been struggling, your child, a loved one, trust your gut, make an appointment, find a certified eating disorder specialist. Worst case scenario, you're wrong.
Yeah.
We know most people, it just takes them quite a bit of time to even get into a doctor's office to get a diagnosis. Some go for years without actually having any proper treatment. So trust your gut, make the appointment. It's a low risk suggestion. And that, like, there's so much to learn about having a healthy relationship with food. Intuitive eating is amazing. I'd recommend people look into it. And there's a lot of really great benefits, especially when it comes to feeding our kids, like using these practices and principles in our home. Sets really great examples for the generations.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. Thank you, Taylor Aasand, for joining me.
Thank you.